Hello and welcome, Adam's Flock, to the first video in a series on the power armor of Fallout. There's so much lore with some of these power armor suits that this video will only be the lore and in-game content regarding the T-51 power armor. I know I usually cover several in-game items in each video, but the T-51 has a huge amount of lore and really deserved its own video. So, grab some fancy lads and turn up the rads as we talk about one of the most iconic elements of the Fallout franchise. Remember to stick around to the end to see my comment highlights I do at the end of every video. Many fans, particularly those that started with the original games, will think of T-51 power armor as the default power armor of the Fallout series, and that's for a very good reason. With the exception of Fallout Tactics, T-51 has featured in every single Fallout game and has been on the cover of Fallout 1 and Fallout 76. No matter what Fallout game you find yourself in, the T-51 is always a standout armor because of its unique aesthetic. Or, like in the first Fallout, it's the only power armor option you have. The exact details of the T-51 armor has changed through time, and I want to cover all these changes as the franchise has progressed and evolved game to game and owner to owner. The first game of the series introduced T-51 power armor, which is more generically referred to as power armor in game, and sometimes referred to as T-51B powered infantry armor. It is usually encountered later in the game because there is only one faction that uses the armor, the fan favorite technology-obsessed recluses, not that one. Yeah, that one. The Brotherhood of Steel. Daryl, a paladin that stands at the entrance of the Brotherhood of Steel bunker, will tell the Vault Dweller that the T-51 armor is worn exclusively by the Brotherhood, and only knights of the highest stature and the so-called honored are given the privilege to wear the armor. Daryl also tells the player that there have been many attempts by Wastelanders to take their power armor, but from what Daryl tells the player, no one has ever been successful. Every Brotherhood of Steel member that has the honor of wearing a suit of armor is shown to use T-51B, and no other kind is referred to in-game. We also learn in-game that Westech was the designer and manufacturer of the armor under contract by the US government. We get some technical details from Fallout 1 from the Zax 1.2 computer. The armor is powered by a TX-28 microfusion pack that is supposed to generate 60,000 watts for the hydraulic systems that seem to control the suit's movement. That is very impressive output, as it could provide continuous power to about 8 average American homes. The in-game description states that it has enough power to last hundreds of years, likely meaning that the suits of power armor being worn in Fallout are using their original power sources. The armor consists of the latest pre-war polylaminate materials that is said to be able to resist up to 2,500 joules of energy. There's been some talk about this though, since a smaller grain .308 round has over 3,500 joules worth of energy, meaning that a common hunting rifle round is apparently enough to defeat the T-51 armor. That doesn't seem to align with how strong the power armor appears in game. Nor does it seem to make sense when compared to modern combat armor that can stop a .308 round. Without getting too much into the weeds, there just seems to be an inconsistency with this exact number, and there have been a number of fan theories to try and make sense of this. Everything from saying joules are not the same unit of measurement in Fallout, so it can withstand more energy than 2,500 real-world joules, to saying that the text technically refers to how much energy it can absorb, and not necessarily whether or not a bullet with more than 2,500 joules of energy would end up piercing the armor. While I do not think that this issue is really that big of a deal, my personal thoughts on the matter are that the 2,500 joules was a mistake either in understanding what that number meant in real-world terms, or there was some sort of typo when the text was written up in the game, and instead it was supposed to refer to 2,500 kilojoules, or maybe 25,000 joules. I also don't think it's terribly problematic, as each person can come up with their own favorite justification that makes the lore consistent, and it doesn't really change much. The last interesting detail that the Zax divulges is that the armor has a 10 micron thick silver ablative coating, meant to reflect laser and radiation emissions, without damaging the underlying armor. Silver is a good option since it is one of the most reflective materials, reflecting up to 95% of incident energy. Although, I can't speak to whether or not a 10 micron thick layer would have any sort of combat utility. I would also imagine that the thin layer would be very prone to damage, especially considering that silver is not a particularly hard metal. It is interesting to note, however, that the in-game stats reflect this special reflective layer, since the damage resistance to laser weaponry is double that of the standard damage resistance. The last interesting lore bit we learn in the first game is that there are life support systems built into the suit that allow the wearers to use the armor for extended periods of time without taking it off. This is supported by the fact that a paladin in the Brotherhood of Steel bunker will tell the player that they can go several weeks without water while wearing the power armor suits, meaning that in addition to an air purification system, there's a way for wearers to relieve themselves, and that is then recycled back into water that the wearers can drink. Although this is not an aspect of the suits that is addressed very much, with the air filtering being an exception, it seems one of the benefits of wearing power armor is that it enables users to survive extended periods of time without critical resources like water. Power armor has been described in lore as a deciding factor in the United States turning the tides in Alaska and declaring victory over the Chinese, and that is often attributed to the increased protection and lethality. However, Fallout 1 implies that increased combat effectiveness may not be solely due to more protection and the ability to carry larger weapons into combat, but to stay combat effective longer than a soldier without a suit, and less susceptible to supply or resource disruptions. There is one variant, if we want to call it that, and it is only referred to as hardened power armor. An NPC known as Miles is a chemist in Additum that can help the player alter their power armor after fixing the hydroponic farms. Miles knows of a process that can be used to harden the surface of the armor, increasing its effectiveness. The player is asked to retrieve chemistry journals that can be found in the hub that apparently contains the details needed for Miles to modify the armor. The end result is a power armor that has increases in most damage resistance categories by 10 and increases damage threshold in many categories as well. Looking at the armor's stats in the first Fallout, it comes as no surprise that it is far and away the best all-around armor, particularly in its hardened form. There are a few armors that can match or sometimes exceed power armor in a few categories, but outside these very specific use cases, T-51 is the best all-around armor in the game. Comparing the stats of the hardened power armor to everything else, it has the highest armor class of all the armors and the highest damage resistance in most categories. Brotherhood combat armor beats out the T-51 in electric and plasma resistance by 10 each, which actually makes a bit of sense. It seems reasonable that the power armor, being reliant on hydraulic and electrical systems, would be more susceptible to electronic interference, which could happen with plasma and, of course, electricity as well. Similarly, Tesla armor does better than power armor against electric and plasma weapons, but also matches power armor's incredible laser resistance, which sits at a mighty 90. Even though these two armors can exceed or match power armor's damage resistance and threshold in some instances, power armor does well above average for all other damage types, and so is a great all-around choice. Power armor also increases radiation resistance by 30 and strength by 3, which helps with the immense weight of the power armor, which is far heavier than any other armor, with the hardened armor sitting at 100 pounds. Now, 100 pounds is not a lot, and when considering how much advanced technology and body-preserving armor there is in one suit, 100 pounds is next to nothing. It'd be like carrying a middle schooler on your back, only that middle schooler could protect you from lasers, block all radiation, and recycle your pee for you. Honestly, that 100 pounds makes more sense simply as a game quirk. Since it would be so much heavier than any other item in the game, it would wreck the carry balancing mechanics. Or it could be argued that the extra weight effect on the player is similar to 100 pounds because of the hydraulic and electrical systems that assist the user, meaning that the power armor largely carries and compensates for itself, and the net result is the user feels like they are only carrying an extra 100 pounds on their body. The Brotherhood of Steel takes a huge backseat in Fallout 2 as they are only really present as outposts guarded by single Brotherhood members, so there are fewer people running around in T-51 power armor. With that though, there are more locations where T-51 armor can be obtained in Fallout 2 than in the first Fallout, where the Brotherhood tightly control the supply and who has access to the supply. One unit can be obtained from the San Francisco Brotherhood bunker after successfully retrieving the vertibird plans from Navarro, and another suit can be bought in San Francisco from the Shi in one of the stores. The Shi are quite technologically advanced, so I don't think it's that unreasonable that they would have a suit kicking around somewhere. And honestly, if I didn't find a suit of T-51 in a Brotherhood of Steel bunker, then I'd be really disappointed. A third suit can be looted from the Mariposa military base, which is interesting because it most likely was stashed there between the events of the first Fallout and Fallout 2, since no such armor is found in the base during the events of Fallout 1. The fourth armor is found on the Enclave oil rig, which is particularly interesting because the Enclave have their own armor that is better and more advanced in every way. So what are they doing with a suit of T-51? Given the Enclave's proclivity to research and develop literally anything, it makes the most sense that they had acquired or recovered T-51 at some point and gleaned what insights they could to assist them in their own power armor pursuits. An alternative theory would also be that it could indicate that they had taken someone prisoner that wore it, whether it was a Brotherhood member or some other unfortunate soul who thought their T-51 could protect them from anything. I guess the last option could also be, since it is found in the barracks, that it was taken by an Enclave soldier as a knick-knack or war trophy. Regardless, the armor exists in much the same form in Fallout 2 as it did in the first Fallout, and there even exists a hardened version that the Chosen One can pay to have created. The lead scientist amongst the Hubologists, known as Crockett, can harden up to 2 suits for the Chosen One, although the process takes several days to complete. It is interesting to note that with all the associated damage resistance and threshold increases, the weight also increases after the hardening process. Perhaps this is just me, but the process of so-called hardening seems like it's altering the composites to change their properties, but the addition of weight would seem to imply that there is a considerable amount of weight being added during the process, although the appearance itself does not change. Similar to Fallout 1, there are other armors that can have better stats in certain areas, like the Combat Armor Mark II and the Tesla Armor, but the T-51 is no longer the king of armor because of the Advanced Power Armor and Advanced Power Armor Mark II, which surpasses or matches T-51 in every way. I won't dive into the Advanced Power Armor here, I'm saving that for another video, but suffice it to say that the T-51 is inferior in almost every way to the post-war Enclave armor, as it should be. Otherwise, all that Enclave research and engineering would be worse than a Legion Denarius after I kicked the Legion's butt out of the Mojave. It is interesting to note that the weight changed significantly between the first 2 games, where a hardened set was at 100 pounds before, it is only half of that at 50, which again is likely to just come down to game mechanics and balancing, but if you have an interesting in-game reason that could justify the change, let's hear it. So here's the subjective part, and there will be a number of you who agree and a number who disagree, and that is what makes it fun. I think the in-game sprite of the armor looks fantastic. And although they look a little like Buzz Lightyear when they don't have their helmets on, the large torso and pauldrons and wide stance definitely makes the armor stand out from everything else. The armor looks a lot more than armor that is simply put on your body. It looks machine-like, like something that augments the body's natural power. I think it really sells itself as this super futuristic armor that can take a ton of damage and increase the strength of the wearer, like the lore states. I will say though, while I like the helmet design, the original design is my least favorite, and the T-51 helmet overall sits behind designs like the T-60 and X-01 armor for me. I now give you all permission to roast me. Fallout 3 is the next time we see T-51 power armor, and the game introduces a good chunk of new lore to the series. Finally seeing this iconic armor in 3D was great, and it is even more exclusive in Fallout 3 than it was in the previous games, as there is only one place to get T-51B in the base game, and another set that was introduced with the Operation Anchorage add-on. What makes its rarity so interesting, however, is the fact that the Brotherhood of Steel are a huge part of the game, a pivotal faction that is regularly encountered and essential to the storyline. So why are there only 2 suits of T-51 in the game? Why has the Brotherhood, who traveled across the continent and likely wore T-51 while still on the West Coast, completely switched over to a new kind of power armor? There is actually no lore reason ever given for the switch, but we can offer a few examples both in and out of game. We know that the Brotherhood found a large stash of T-45 armor at the old Pentagon that they decided to equip their soldiers with during the events of Fallout 3, so it is possible that after trekking across the country, it was easier to switch over to a huge stock of relatively unused T-45 armor than fixing all the T-51 that they had lugged across the continent with little or no supplies. In a similar vein, T-45 may have been simpler. No fancy pants polylamination going on, and therefore T-45 is easier to repair, which is better for the Brotherhood as they grapple with firmly establishing themselves in the capital wasteland. These of course have their own issues, like why is there so little T-51 in the capital wasteland to begin with? But again, there could be a number of ways to justify this. An out-of-game explanation for the lack of T-51 in Fallout 3 would be that Bethesda was wanting to introduce a new armor to make it the face of the series, now that they were in control. It would also continue a trend where the newly introduced armor is on the cover, since Advanced Power Armor featured on the Fallout 2 game cover, and the Midwestern Brotherhood armor on the front of the Fallout Tactics cover. This means more than anything they were following an established tradition, and to justify a new armor, it had to be seen in-game, and so we see the Brotherhood opt for the T-45 over the T-51. It isn't until the Operation Anchorage add-on that we learn a bit more about T-51, although we always have to be dubious about what lore we take from that add-on since it is known to be embellished and not strictly true to reality. We know that the Fallout Bible mentions power armor and its effectiveness in Alaska, as it helped turn the tides of the war against China and was even used in the invasion of China. Anchorage seems to confirm that by showing its deployment, particularly when breaching the Chinese encampment and fighting General Jingwei. The simulation also seems to show how effective the armor is, as power armored units fight their way pretty easily through heavily armed Chinese soldiers, but get stopped dead by the electric pulse field, which would confirm that they are weak to electricity. There are 2 sets of T-51B in all of Fallout 3, and both are difficult to get. It seems that Bethesda knew many players would want the T-51 armor and set it up to be given as a really nice reward. The suit in the base game is rewarded after completing Gotta Shoot 'em in the Head, where the player has to retrieve keys from some old mercenaries who were involved in a job by Alistair Tenpenny to get something special from the military installation Fort Constantine. The Lone Wanderer can give the keys to Mr. Crawley, who gives the player the mission, or they can go to Fort Constantine themselves to retrieve the special item, which turns out to be a suit of T-51B power armor. It is being held in a stasis field in the R&D facility, giving the impression that T-51 was still pretty experimental, or that this particular set of armor was meant to become a more advanced version before the Great War ended those efforts. Maybe we finally would have gotten a T-51C if it weren't for that silly little nuclear war. The Operation Anchorage DLC gives a glimpse into the war between the United States and China with some, shall we say, artistic liberties. We see T-51 being worn, repaired, and used during the events of the DLC, although it uses a special version known as the winterized T-51B, which was modified to operate in the freezing conditions in Alaska, and it has some visual differences from the suit that the player can get in the base game. It is not green, instead being more gray and blue, has some army symbols and livery including an army star and pre-war US flag on the back, and is lacking any rust. The aesthetic differences aren't particularly drastic, but what really stands out with the winterized version is the insane stat difference. Although the damage resistance goes down by 5 compared to the base game version, the item HP increases to a completely absurd 9,992,000 hit points. For reference, the base game T-51 has 2,000 hit points, so they are not even remotely comparable. How in all of Adam's creation is this even possible? How can the base version have 0.02% of the hit points of the winterized version? Once again, we could come up with some lore-friendly guesses and justifications, and I'd like to hear any that you guys have, but I think the most probable reason is simply that Bethesda accidentally swapped the 2 in-game versions of the winterized T-51. See, in the simulation, weapon and armor degradation doesn't really happen because it is a simulation and not real life. A set of armor with almost 10 million HP is effectively invincible and won't degrade a noticeable amount no matter how much damage you take, realistically speaking. So the suit of armor that was only meant to be used by the player in the simulation and not be degraded was accidentally swapped with the one that was meant to be outside of the simulation and could degrade, and therefore we have a nigh invincible piece of armor. Since the player can run straight to the Outcast Outpost and complete this DLC at the very beginning of the game, it means that the player can have by far the best power armor in the game and never have to worry about repairing it, and it is without a doubt the most broken suit of armor in the whole game. Since the helmet and armor are separate armor items in Fallout 3, that also means that the helmet and armor will have different stats and potentially different perks. For that reason, the suit has nearly 10 million HP and plus 25 to rad resistance, and that helmet has almost 100,000 HP, plus 8 rad resistance and plus 1 charisma, however that's supposed to work. Since there are only 2 pairs of T-51 power armor, there is no chance to repair damaged T-51 except to pay NPCs for their repair services, which can get very expensive. Or, you can just wear the virtually invincible winterized power armor and never even worry about having to repair the armor the entire game. It is also interesting to note that since the winterized version of the power armor has the US Army livery on the front and back, the absence of these on the base T-51 model indicates that it was not a suit of armor that was used in the war against China. When comparing T-51 to all the other power armors in the game, we see a different picture from what we saw in Fallout 2. In Fallout 2, the Enclave Advanced Power Armor was much superior to the T-51 in almost every respect, and that made sense. It was the culmination of well over a century of research and development, and should be better than the pre-war T-51 armor. However, the so-called Advanced Power Armor Mark II, which is distinct from the Fallout 2 armor, is not as obviously superior to the Fallout 3 T-51B. The T-51B has 10 more damage resistance than the Enclave Power Armor, is 5 pounds lighter, and also blocks more radiation. The only thing the Enclave Power Armor does better is that it increases strength by 1. But this is also negated by an agility debuff of 1 as well, so at the end of the day it's just kind of 6s. There's a lot more Enclave power armor, so repairing it with other sets is not a problem. But again, the winterized version is effectively invincible, so that's not really that much of an advantage. Comparing it to the Enclave Hellfire armor closes the performance gap more, since they have the same damage resistance, weigh the same, and the Hellfire offers +1 to strength and +30 to fire resistance as well, only being beaten out by the T-51 in radiation resistance. The Hellfire is arguably just a smidgen better than the T-51, but again, you have to remember that the Enclave power armor in Fallout 2 was very obviously superior to the T-51, so what happened here? Obviously the two games are balanced differently, and Bethesda wanted the T-51 to be uncommon and an endgame armor, meaning that it needed to be competitive with the Enclave armor since fighting the Enclave is a very important part of the game and subsequent Broken Steel add-on. Let's hear some thoughts from you guys as to why the difference between T-51 power armor and Enclave Advanced Power Armor Mark II and Hellfire armor is much smaller than the difference in Fallout 2. And as always, you get extra points for being lore friendly. Looking at the armor subjectively, I have some things that I like over the Fallout 2 version, and things I don't like as much. The helmet, which was my least favorite part of the Fallout 2 design, I think looks a bit better in Fallout 3. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it seems like some features are a bit smoother and don't jut out quite as much as they do on the original version. The eye slit is also a bit more uniform rather than pinching in the middle, which gives it a more medieval suit of armor vibe. That said, when it comes to the body of the armor, I think the original version is far and away better. The power armor in Fallout 3 in New Vegas looks like something that slips on over clothes, but doesn't give the impression of a mechanized suit. It just conforms too much to the body, with normal stance and chest widths that don't convey the larger-than-life power that these suits imbue to their wearers. Everything is just a little too small, and walking would be so annoying in these suits. Just look at the gap between the legs. Where's my thigh gap? I really hope you enjoy the sound of polylaminate rubbing against each other everywhere you go, because that's what you're gonna get. All the way across the continent in the sun-scorched Mojave, we get to see T-51 again since the events of Fallout 3. T-51 armor in New Vegas looks exactly like the non-winterized version of Fallout 3 and is used almost exclusively by the Brotherhood of Steel, similar to the previous West Coast games. We don't get much new lore information related to the armor, and Fallout New Vegas seems to de-emphasize power armor as a whole. Comparing T-51 to the other power armor types that can be used in-game, the only armors that can come close are the so-called Remnants power armor, which is old Enclave Advanced Power Armor. The T-51 has lower damage threshold than the Enclave power armor, but also has more health, and by that I mean substantially more health. T-51 sits at 2000 HP, while the Remnant armor is just 400. So while the Remnant armor can withstand higher damage attacks due to its higher damage threshold, it will deteriorate much quicker than the T-51 power armor due to the HP difference. T-51 is 5 pounds lighter, and they both have the same 1 strength boost, but the T-51 protects against radiation by 10 more points. Again, we see the difference between the armors is not as clean cut as it seemed in Fallout 2, and they both seem to have distinct advantages and disadvantages. And I, for one, really like that. Perhaps this could be explained by the fact that Remnant power armor is exactly that. Old Enclave Advanced Power Armor suits that have potentially fallen into states of disrepair, or at least they're not working quite as well as when the Enclave were out ruining people's lives in Fallout 2. That would certainly be plausible, but it is obvious that the designers of New Vegas did not want the advanced power armor to be instantly considered an upgrade, adding more nuance to the whole situation where people could opt for the armor that would protect more. but would also fall apart much quicker if the attacks are extremely damaging. Again, I like this nuance, since games can very easily fall into the trap of tiering the gear in a way that there is little to no incentive to hold on to older gear that is obviously outclassed, and I feel like that method was closer to how Fallout 2 approached its power armor. Several years later, and once again across the continent, we find ourselves in Fallout 4, romping around in the Commonwealth with some massive changes to not just T-51 power armor, but all power armor. One of the more controversial changes that is very well known to everyone by now is the use of newly introduced fusion cores to power the armor. Previously, lore directly from the first Fallout stated that the power armor, or more specifically T-51B, used a microfusion reactor that would be able to power the armor for hundreds of years. All armor, including T-51, now uses fusion cores. These are replaceable, but most importantly, quickly depletable, and the player is required to have several on hand, otherwise they risk running out of power for their armor. There is no other way to slice this than to simply call it for what it is, a retcon. And there is a wide belief that Bethesda introduced fusion cores for the simple fact that they made power armor available almost right out of the vault. Previously, power armor wouldn't even be seen in the earlier Fallouts until later in the game, and was too expensive or difficult to get until the player was higher level. Fallout 3 and New Vegas locked power armor usage behind a perk that disallowed the players to even equip power armor, effectively blocking the player's ability to get power armor in the early game. Fallout 4 lets the sole survivor use power armor during the rescue of the Minutemen, which is just outside the area of Sanctuary, meaning most players will have this be one of the first missions that they do. In order to keep the newly acquired power armor from being used extensively after helping the Minutemen, fusion cores were introduced so that the resource-poor new player would be forced to park the power armor in their settlement until they can acquire more fusion cores. While I think this idea has merit, I don't think that this entire mechanic was implemented for the sake of this power fantasy set piece that is the Minutemen rescue mission. I do think though that the changes made to power armor necessitated the implementation of an expendable energy source to help limit power armor use. Of course, those big changes I talk about have more to do with the fact that Fallout 4 took it upon itself to make power armor actually look and function like futuristic powered armor. Getting in and out of the power armor shows how exoskeleton-like the armor is, and the expanded crafting system in Fallout 4 adds a ton of new customization options for weapons and armor. The number of upgrades that the power armor can be saddled with is very impressive, and while most of them are stat boosting like an internal database, increasing intelligence, or rad scrubbers lowering incident radiation, there are many that change the way the power armor works, like a targeting HUD that highlights living organisms, Tesla coils that do extra damage to nearby enemies, a stealth boy mod that activates when crouching, and even a jetpack that, well, I hope I don't need to explain what that's used for. In addition, Fallout 4 implemented sprinting and weapon bashing mechanics that also affect power armor. And all these extra mechanics and upgrades, in my humble opinion, are a greater justification for the implementation of fusion cores, rather than the initial Minutemen mission and early game set piece. A lot of these expanded capabilities come at the cost of using more energy, and if power armor energy was something that never had to be even thought about, there wouldn't be a limiting mechanic that would make the player weigh the costs of using these extra functions. Honestly though, they could have gone about it in a different way, for sure. Like instead of making power a limiting factor, introduce a heat mechanic, where using energy intensive systems for a period of time would increase internal heat that would have to have a cooldown before they could be used again. Or maybe even have the base models of all the armors be able to be powered infinitely by the fusion reactor, but as soon as there are any upgrades, it will have to be switched over to fusion cores. You could make up some pretty decent justification. Just say that the fusion cores have higher peak power and therefore are the only options for upgraded power armor or something akin to that. Regardless, with all the potential upgrades that are introduced with Fallout 4, the armors can also be upgraded to better and more advanced versions that boost the armor's base stats. So while I've been joking this whole video about when are we going to see the next version of the T-51, since everything in the game is T-51B, these version upgrades that can be done in Fallout 4 finally give us different versions, at least in name. T-51 can be had in A through F models, which increases damage resistance, HP, and radiation resistance with each level. It doesn't translate to an actual physical change that can be seen in the armor, and the materials needed to upgrade don't give us a lot of information about what is being done to the armor. simply requiring aluminum, circuitry, nuclear material, and adhesive in varying amounts. For the first time since the original games, we see hints at the power armor having more life-prolonging tech, with modifications that can be done to the armor. A medic pump will auto-stim the player when they take enough damage, which was also present in the Fallout 3 era games, but also a so-called blood cleanser that reduces the chance of addiction to drugs. Whether this means that there's an actual scrubber that blood is routed through in the suit, which I kind of doubt, but hey, this is Fallout after all, or there is a non-invasive monitoring system that when it detects toxicity in the bloodstream will then apply some sort of treatment that tries to bring things back to normal levels. Unless you're Kate, of course, then your blood is mostly drugs anyway. We get some good lore bits and confirmation of previous lore from Fallout 3. A loading screen confirms that T-51 was introduced and used in the Battle of Anchorage, while also stating that it was the pinnacle of pre-war power armor technology, which would seem to imply that there was no power armor more advanced than T-51 before the time of the Great War. Hold on to that little nugget of information for a little later. Terminal entries at Fort Strong in Boston by one General Brock records that a team called Alpha Team was meant to do at least some research and development on the T-51B power armor, and then ship it off to the war in Alaska. He records that they are doing better than they had initially expected, and were, quote, chewing through enemy tanks and armor. He then relates a rumor that enemy troops are sometimes known to surrender just at the sight of power-armored units that were normally equipped with 5mm miniguns. Taking a look at how T-51 stacks up against the other armors, it falls between the common power armor models. Comparing the basic power armor models against each other, the T-51 is noticeably better than Raider power armor and T-45 power armor in all regards except for radiation resistance, which is the same all across the board. It does get beat out, however, by the newly introduced T-60 and X-01 power armor, relegating it to being firmly in the middle of the pack. Now, remember that loading screen that stated that T-51 was the pinnacle of pre-war power armor tech? Well, the newly introduced X-01 seemed to be Bethesda's take on the Enclave Advanced Power Armor, but then Nuka World made it very clear that X-01 was pre-war, when a Nuka-Cola Quantum version had been sitting safely for centuries inside Nuka World. While the community at large argued the implications of X-01 being pre-war in origin and which information sources to trust the most, Bethesda was secretly solidifying the lore of X-01 in the upcoming Fallout 76 game. What was less discussed, however, was that T-60 power armor was also shown to be pre-war in origin, since the soldiers guarding Vault 111 were outfitted with T-60, and it is shown in the game to be superior in almost every way to T-51 power armor. So the X-01 is far from the only problematic armor here. Fallout 4 doesn't have much in the way of unique variants, due to how the crafting system works. However, there is one unique piece of T-51 armor, and that is the piezonucleic torso that can be created at Cambridge Polymer Labs. Technically, this can be a T-45 or a T-51 torso piece depending on the player's level, but let's just pretend that it's just for the T-51. After gathering the requisite and rather exotic materials, the automated system which was set up before the war by a research group can be kicked off again, yielding the so-called piezonucleic torso. And even if you have enough material for a second torso, the process can only be done once. The legendary effect attached to the torso converts ionizing radiation into electrical energy, meaning that getting irradiated will result in increased action point refresh. As far as the name, I could find no reference to piezonucleic anything, and I think it is just an alteration of piezoelectric, which is the phenomenon where an electrical current is induced from pressure on a material, like for example quartz. It would have made a lot more sense to rename it to something like radioelectric, which would convey the idea of transferring radiation into electricity rather than piezonucleic, since piezo is Greek for pressure or push, and nucleic refers to a cell's nucleus. Apparently at some point in Fallout 4's development, the item generated at the Polymer Cambridge lab would have been the so-called nucleostrictive torso, which would have been a T-60 torso that would decrease the rate of fusion core depletion by 10%. Once again, the name doesn't make much sense, but I'm glad there's a chance that the armor is T-51, since that armor needs a lot more love in Fallout 4. The only other unique armor set would be the Nuka T-51 armor, that has a non-craftable Nuka-Cola paint scheme. Other than conferring an extra 3 agility, the armor is just like the base F model power armor, and we were blessed with this special armor, due to the unique ties of Nuka-Cola and the US military. I sure do love myself some military-industrial complex. Looking at this armor, it looks a lot more like the original T-51 design, just primarily due to the fact that the stance is different with a lot more space between the legs, rather than having them almost touch like the Fallout 3 and New Vegas models. There is a weight with every step, and the running animation is a lot different from the animation for characters outside of power armor, and it really helps sell the bulk and weight of the armor. The proportions are usually thicker, particularly around the feet and legs, and the hands are armored as well, rather than being just gloved. This design is by far my favorite, as the looks coupled with how the armor moves make it truly machine-like, and I love the introduction of the Pain Train perk that makes the character put their shoulder down and charge enemies, knocking them to the ground. I also like the fact that the power armor is not modified to expose the player's Pip-Boy, opting for an in-helmet HUD instead. It just makes the whole thing look a lot better, and it would be such a pain to try and modify power armor to accommodate a Pip-Boy. My honest opinion of the Fallout 4 armor is that it is the best representation so far in the series, as it really sells the bulk and power that the lore has come to paint power armor as. It would have been cool to do a little fan service and offer a power armor mod in the form of so-called hardened armor, like what can be found in the first two Fallouts, especially if it was only available for the T-51 due to its unique composite armor. That would have been some good fan service and a nod to the old games, but alas, it was not meant to be. So that brings us to the last game of the series so far, the infamous Fallout 76. This game has a few lore additions for the T-51 and for the previously mentioned X-01, which in turn has implications for T-51. We learn from terminals in the Grafton Steel plant about a project known as Project Phoenix, where Grafton Steel researchers were looking into utilizing power armor for mining and other industrial applications, and a prototype helmet was underway with plans for the rest of a suit. Grafton Steel used the T-51 as the base model for their research, and thus the helmet is a T-51 helmet, with extra steel plates bolted to the front, while also removing most of the peripherals and adding a small antenna. It has the effect of increasing energy resistance, since the original design was to withstand heat that a normal human could not bear for long down in the mine shafts. Unfortunately, only the helmet was fully prototyped, and it is given to the player as a paint rather than a full mod, and the paint will only apply to the helmet and not the rest of the armor. Similarly, a new armor in Fallout 76 known as the Ultrasight armor was a design that was initially based off of the T-51 as a prototype created by the Brotherhood of Steel. I will cover this armor in depth in another video, but suffice it to say that the visual resemblance is immediately noticeable, with some alterations to the pauldrons, chestplate, and helmet, where the muzzle of the helmet extends up enough to split the lens into two separate lenses, which I actually think looks awesome. I mean, just look at that. Looking at how the T-51 stacks up with the other available power armor sets, we once again see that due to how Bethesda looked to balance the game, it ranks differently compared to the other armors. Whereas in the last game, Fallout 4 had it firmly in the middle of the pack, with no real interesting characteristics or strengths. This time, it is a bit more nuanced. T-51 now has the second highest damage resistance of all suits, including X-01 and T-60, which were previously significantly better than T-51. Only the newly introduced T-65 suits have higher damage resistance, and similarly, T-65 has higher energy resistance, but T-51 beats out every other power armor in that regard too. The one area that T-51 comes in dead last, even being beat out by the weakest of all the armors, the newly introduced Excavator power armor, is radiation resistance. I find that interesting, considering past games had all the power armors the same or nearly the same in regards to radiation resistance, and the first Fallout considered power armor, of which only the T-51 was in the game, to be some of the best protection against radiation. It is even beat out by Raider power armor for radiation resistance, which I have a really hard time believing those rusted out hunks of metal have better seals and radiation protection than T-51. Perhaps the composite material is not as good at absorbing ionizing radiation compared to the slabs of steel or iron that many of the other suits use as armor. I don't really know, I'm just spitballing here at this point. It is also on the lighter side of all the power armor sets, although they are all within 10 pounds of each other, so it doesn't matter a whole lot. I always imagined the T-51, due to using composite layered armor, to be lighter than T-45 or T-60, which appear to have simpler materials in their construction, and I would like to see more variation amongst power armor in future games. I think specialization keeps things interesting and prevents people from completely disregarding power armor they picked up previously because the new armor is superior in every way. There are some lore implications that we discussed previously that Fallout 76 seems to have remedied. The big one was that a loading screen had stated T-51 was the latest in power armor technology before the Great War, but Nuka World seemed to indicate that X-01 was also pre-war, and it is by far better than T-51 stat-wise. In Fallout 76, we see that X-01 is no longer obviously superior, as it and T-60 are both beaten out by T-51 for damage and energy resistance. Fallout 76 also specifically confirms the fact that X-01 is pre-war in origin, but I'll save those details for a future video where I talk about that armor specifically. The T-51 in 76 looks the same as in Fallout 4, however, there are more unique paint schemes which really helps keeps things interesting. What are your thoughts on T-51 and its evolution through the series? I would like to hear what you have to say in the comments regarding T-51. How does it rank amongst the other power armors for you? If you started with the first Fallouts, how do you feel about its representation in the later games? This power armor is such an icon that no matter what game you have played, you have at least a few personal thoughts or opinions. So here we are at the end of the video, but we have the comment highlights to get to, so if you want to see some of my favorite comments from my last video on the OP tech of Fallout, keep listening. I feature comments that correct me on information I get wrong, give greater insight or information on something interesting, or that are just funny and clever. To kick this off, a few of you corrected me that the vending machines in the Dead Money DLC did indeed come from the think tank, and you're right. That was a mistake on my part. The Sierra Madre Casino and Big Mountain had a special relationship that meant that Sinclair seemed to have a monopoly on Big Mountain tech. A few of you talked about those incredible vending machines and put forth some good suggestions as to how they work, like that they are small particle colliders or create elements using nucleosynthesis. Honestly, it would have to be something along those lines since it would require messing with physics at the atomic level in order to generate anything you could possibly think of. While on the topic of dead money, Smiling Nid corrected me that Sinclair was not trying to scalp his workers by paying them in Sierra Madre chips, although that certainly was the sentiment among the workers who started to get paid in something that was not US dollars. Mr. Sinclair's intent was to move past the US dollar and start using what he thought was a superior form of currency. So while well intentioned on Sinclair's part, it looks like it was not well received and it was poorly implemented, and goes down as another starry-eyed, well-intentioned effort on the part of an ultra-wealthy technocrat. A few of you mentioned that the holograms in the Sierra Madre with their incredible capabilities were similar to the hard light projections from Halo. I think that is actually a great comparison since they operate very similarly, and maybe this Forerunner hard light technology served as an inspiration for the Sierra Madre projections. Joe Biden brought up a great point and asked if there was some sort of delay when activating the GEC, since doing so in Fallout 3 will cause it to instantly detonate and kill the player. That is a really great point. It seems like a pretty unfriendly feature if there is no delay involved. Maybe it's just one last cruel test by Vault-Tec. Deviant Breed made a good point in stating that the data draining capabilities of the Robo-Scorpions that have the think tank terrified only work when recovering data from computers and the like. They can't actually drain the knowledge from the think tank, but Mobius lets the think tank continue thinking that because it helps keep them terrified of his Robo-Scorpions and therefore serves to help Mobius in his goals. Now I also want to acknowledge that a lot of you asked why one technology or another was not included in the list, and the fact of the matter is that the video is just not long enough to talk about every single piece of advanced tech in the Fallout series. There were a number of good suggestions though, that might warrant a follow-up video if there is enough interest. Some of the good suggestions are the stealth tech, cloning machine from Nuka World, and power armor among many others. Let me know in the comments if you would like a follow-up video covering the suggestions in the comments. And that brings us to the end of the comment highlights and therefore my video. Hold to Adam's word, brothers and sisters. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in my next video.